Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's Deslin Wood, and I'm here to talk to you about leading in uncertainty. And the topic today is called Panic in the C-Suite. Happy to have you back. Wanted to wish everybody a happy new year. Yeah, it's a new year. I know January already still feels like it's been 3 months long. And so today I'm going to really be focusing on, the difference between moving swiftly with information and moving swiftly without information. And we're going to start and kick it off with a quote from John DeYoung, who's an influencer in terms of innovation and disruption. And one of the things he talks about is how, we've heard this a lot, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended the world in ways big and small, and from back offices to boardrooms and across industries and geographies. And so, we have this thing that's happened to everyone in the world. So we're able to do essentially a study of how it's impacting, many different countries in many different industries. And the C-suite is something that's been impacted as well, because, we're not only asking people to think differently, they have to think differently, both in the short and in the long term. What do I mean by that? If we think about, what happened in March 2020 and put a lightning bolt over the middle, because depending on where you are in the world, it was somewhere between, the beginning to the middle of the end of March, is, we had these positions being challenged with certain things. And so, our chief executive officers had to really worry about the survival of their employees as well as the survival of their business. So literally, the health and safety of businesses and people. Our heads of marketing saw consumers' habits flip. People weren't leaving the house all of a sudden, and what they were prioritizing, whether it be toilet paper or tops over bottoms, completely had changed. So, consumer behavior switched, instantaneously. We had our chief revenue officers who typically predict and plan sales based on what happened last week, last month, last year. So they usually look backwards in order to predict the future, when in fact, your sales from this month last year had nothing to do with what was going to happen this year. So how do you rewrite the sales playbook? And then in my own world, the chief people officers had to rethink everything we did for this new blended workforce of some people who are still on the ground and the majority of people who are then working from home. And so how do we rethink everything we do from our culture, recruitment, performance for this remote world? And so this is what was going on as we kicked off last year. And what's really interesting is that, this question was, how can you be focused on weathering what felt like a temporary situation that was urgent, and at the same time understand that you have to reframe the business model for your company going forward, because the shifts people were seeing were, recognized as being, the future speeding up. So, if it was just a storm or a hurricane, you could say we have to, batten down the hatches for this next couple of months, and then we're just going to reopen. But the changes that were happening in the work world, whether it was a shift to remote world or a shift in how people are consuming, or even how people are spending their free time, everybody could see that these were things that were coming and trickling slowly, but were now likely here to stay. And the biggest questions were, are we ever really going to go back to exactly what we did? Are we going to go back to flying across the country for a meeting? Maybe not. And so we had this group of people focusing on the short term, but also recognizing that what they're doing here likely will have to carry out into some way, shape, or form into the future. And so I brought this up before, which is, the big difference is that most people who reach a certain level, and I include myself in that, focus with the understanding that what we did in the past is really going to help inform our decisions in the future. And when you get into a time of uncertainty, that means that you can't rely on what happened before to decide what you're going to do next. And so all that experience that you've relied on, that's probably become sort of comforting and comfortable, is now going to be coming into question. So you're in this state of uncertainty. And, many people at the beginning of last year, in the middle of last year, were, waiting for it to go back to normal, to bring us back to certainty, bring us back to the way that we knew how to do things. And, one of the things that I think is still a good thing that's happened to many of us is that living in uncertainty changes your behavior in a way that I think is going to ensure the long-term survival of an organization. I think certainty has actually become something that is counterproductive for companies and organizations that need to change. So I like to think of the picture of certainty because, I've worked with certainty, hands up if anybody has as well. Certainty is the person who has all the answers, who's done this all before, who the minute you're like, what we could do, they're like, yeah, no, that doesn't work. And they're like, literally as you're speaking, just waiting for you to stop being like, are you done? Are you done? Because I got something to say. Certainty is a closed way of thinking. It's full of knowledge. It's full of experience, and it isn't at all curious. In fact, what it's trying to do usually is confirm what it already knows. And so when you have a person who suffers from certainty, or an organization or an industry, what happens is they lose their sense of curiosity. Well, what we have seen is a rebirth of uncertainty. And that means that you're like aware and listening. Your antenna are up. You're going to try to pick up what's going on in the world. And what we saw was people jumping to learning, jumping to read, to post, tons of activity on LinkedIn and in virtual events and virtual conferences. And everybody's trying to get into these specialized groups where they can share knowledge and information because they don't know anymore. And what I like to think about is there was a period in my life where I was open and learning all the time. I wasn't certain about anything. In fact, you could disagree with me and I would be like really curious as to what you're thinking. And you don't even realize when you lose that, when you lose the sense of openness, curiosity, and wonder, and you really go to a place of whether you're actually cutting people off in reality or in your mind, where you're finishing sentences for people and you're not listening anymore. And so I think that this time of openness is really what's going to allow leaders who are traditionally maybe sometimes the roadblock of the change to start to become the change. So I spent a lot of my career waiting for like dinosaurs of whatever era to move away from roles so that change could happen. And what I saw starting last year is that existing people in existing roles were starting to regain that youthful curiosity and wonder. And that's really important because you have to break your own rules. You have to rewrite playbooks right now. That's what's happening. So the rules-based approach of how you do business has to shift because the game has changed. And so whenever I'm doing workshops like this, I always bring up with leaders who are saying, well, it's very hard to identify your own rules. But what you should do is do something like this with your team. And I do this all the time with people, which is I ask people, what are the outdated beliefs of their business? I literally tell a story about monkeys. You might have heard my story already. And it really features this idea that we're not even aware of how many things have become part of our culture, the myth of our business, that we think we have to function this way. And what you do is you can, use this kind of storytelling and then ask a broad group of people to say, what are the outdated things that we're doing that have to stop in order for us to embrace change? Because what happens in most organizations is that people are trying to bring in new ideas while the old ideas are still in play. And so trying to do both at the same time essentially is like canceling each other out. It's like, how can I bring in this new way of doing it if the old way is still being wildly defended and used? So I did one of these about decision making, which I find is really interesting. So if you get a broad group of people and you say, what do we need to do to sort of, bring our decision making to the new era? I got this comment once that I just want to share every time, which is stop inviting senior people to meetings unless necessary. Allow people to make decisions and not defer to the most senior person in the room. And I'm going to dig into this because I feel like it's so important is that, what happens when we have a lot of senior people is that because they come with closed and knowing, and then, people are trying to bring up new ideas. If the senior person sort of makes the lemon face, ugh, not sure about that, or sort of like rolls their eyes or really challenges, there's a fear that other people can't bring in new ideas. And what I've often talked to senior people is that it's not that you can't go to a meeting, but is there a way you can go to the meeting, keep a neutral face and not participate? Because when you do participate, even though you mean well, you might be lowering the creativity in the room by the way you're reacting to that new idea. It says we suffer from groupthink because we always, agree with the highest person in the room. And again, that's really hard not to do because, there's a lot of reinforcement for agreeing with people. Not only leaders know what's going on in the company, you need to be able to disagree with people. There's one more here. Only a select few people make decisions. So, what came out to me when I've been doing decision-making work is there's a lot of people who have a lot of input they want to give, but the structure and the construct of the hierarchy makes it really hard to do that in a safe way. And so, outdated decision-making might be, stifling the creative people that we need in order to really pivot our business into this new paradigm. And, why is it? Why is it that we have trouble with this? And, ego is a big part of it. And, the idea of feeling that you're very important and that you need to protect that importance by reinforcing it is very powerful in our culture, especially as people move up in their positions. I love this from Corn Ferry. It's called The Myth of Attainment. I'll give you a moment to read it. what it finishes with is many C-suite executives conclude consciously or unconsciously that they have nothing more to learn. So this myth of attainment, this idea that, by nature of, having, in the traditional world of offices, a corner office with your name on the door, your name over a parking spot, this distorting effect it can have on you makes it really hard for you to actually, see value in other people's opinions. And, it's an interesting thing to talk about because uh, Thoughtexchange, which I'm going to talk about after, our software is based on the idea that, the best idea should be the one that gets the most attention, not the idea that comes from the person with the biggest title. And I recently had somebody talk to me about, that's interesting because I was reading about this other kind of software that you put in, your level and your title and your credentials, and then it gives a certain weight to your opinion. So if you have all of these credentials, your opinion will get weighted higher, like what you think, and somebody else will get a lower ranked opinion. And I was like, okay, there's software to do just what we do all the time as human beings. I don't think you need to buy a software to make you value the idea of somebody's over somebody else's. That's actually the problem. So what we do here is this myth of attainment has made us think that information is more important from certain people, and then we weight it that way. And I'm a huge fan of Liz Wiseman. I bring her up all the time, because her book really impressed me, which is the idea that our role as leaders is to multiply the intelligence in the room. And in fact, many of us want to multiply it, but in fact, we accidentally diminish it. And we accidentally diminish it in a variety of ways. And I found that to be such an interesting thing to think about, which is like, am I in this moment multiplying the intelligence in this room or in this organization? Or in order to feed my own ego or for power and dynamics, am I diminishing it in order to serve myself? And so her idea, which I bring up again because I'm hoping you're going to try it, is she had 4 poker chips she gave herself, which are the 4 opinions she was allowed to give in a day, and realizing that her chips would be done by 9:30 in the morning. And I really love this piece. I've done this workshop where I actually gave out poker chips to everybody in the room to inspire them to do this, which is really think about what you're weighing in on. And if you are the best person with the best idea, and that once you weigh in, how easy is it for somebody else who's maybe not, running a company or a department or a team to challenge that way of thinking. And in order to do this, you really have to have an exercise in humility, which is to really decide that you are going to allow yourself to not be the smartest person in the room, and you're not going to have value, cited by you always being right and agreed with. And I call this a lesson learned in Spain because many years ago I went for a job interview in Spain, and the one of the interviewers, it was very late in the day, I think like my 7th or 8th interview of the day, was with had a translator, and they asked me a question and I was giving a very, very big answer. And the person translated it back saying that the person interviewing me was worried that I wasn't humble. And I was like, God, I'm in a job interview. I'm trying to sell myself. Like, I'm not going to be humble. And so the translator and I were going back and forth as to what she was trying to say to me. And she said, oh, okay, no, I think what I was misinterpreting, the person's worried that you're not flexible. And really the idea is that, I had a lot of North American views on how to do business. And this person from Europe was challenging whether I would be flexible enough to adopt their way of doing business and giving that a try. And I had a long thought on my long, long flight home about the relationship between humility and flexibility. That in fact, they are very much related, because what's the likelihood you're going to be open and flexible to a different way of doing business if you're not humble at all? And in fact, maybe the person who had asked that question was actually really asking me the same thing. Humble, flexible, it doesn't matter what word it was the same concept. And it really has challenged me to say, when I'm, really doubling down on something I believe, is this an example of a lack of humility, a lack of flexibility? In fact, isn't it the same thing? And so, one of the things that I like to push is to ask people, what advice do you have for us? What advice do you have for the senior managers? And ask it in a way, because it's anonymous and using Thought Exchange, that people can provide input and information that that allows you to listen to them without necessarily devaluing them. And it doesn't bump into your own ego, your lack of flexibility. And a lot of the things that we heard when we ran these exchanges at the beginning of COVID was like, we're not the same company that we were, 6 months or 5 years ago. So, we need to start to think differently and make sure you're listening to what's happening here. And I really love all of these things because it's pushing us to broaden our circle and hear from our people. And, this is when I'm going to get into managing in crisis. So just to catch you up on where we've come to so far is that, we have a new business paradigm, and we have executives who've been in roles for a long time who've relied traditionally on their experience either in that domain or in that organization from the ground up. And that experience is no longer as valued or as important as perhaps gathering the experience of other people. And so in this piece, we layer in crisis. And so crisis has an interesting impact on people. And that's that it has this desire, this push to move quickly. So, we have to be thinking of how does the impact of that pressure also challenge our way of making decisions. So it's, C-suites are now focused on business continuity and recovery. They're going to lose sight of necessarily what they need to be doing for the future. And so I use this picture of a hydra. Again, I heard this on a podcast about hydra. It's on Invisibilia. It's worth it. What does it talk about is that hydra are basically immortal. They're immortal. What I mean by that is that, they essentially, what they do is they don't age. So as opposed to, aging, which is just the system continuing, it continuously reinvents and rebirths itself, kind of like stem cells. It's constantly reinventing itself so that it can continue to live and it continue to not age, so it can reproduce indefinitely. And I really think, nature has showed us one example of the ability to continuously reinvent itself. And that's the way that we have to do it. And so when I was thinking of like, what is it that happens in the crisis that maybe causes you to survive the crisis, but maybe not survive the longer game? Like, how do you play a short and long game at the same time? And I love this idea of first responders, because first responders have to act quickly with whatever information is available. So the idea here is that you have to act really fast with what you've got. You can't be hemming and hawing. You won't be 100% sure, but you have to also be calm enough to take inventory of what you do know so that the decision is the best decision that can be made without full knowledge. So they must decide with speed over precision, adapt boldly, reliable to deliver and engage for impact. So again, it's like this factor of like, I need to look at everything I can and be curious, but also move quickly. And those two things often don't happen together. I took this from like the idea of the Beautiful Mind movie. There's that great moment where he's looking at that huge room full of different pieces of data and trying to connect them. The best leaders process quickly what's available, and they rapidly determine what matters most to make decisions with conviction. So they're moving decisively, not because they're not paying attention to everything. It's because they're able to process a ton of information quickly and make that decision. So it's a really important switch that we have to think of, because most people, when they act quickly, act in panic. So panic is also swift acting, but it's swift acting with blinders. And there's a reason why people act swiftly with blinders. In fact, when you're panicking, the hormones that are released, the adrenaline and the cortisol, are there to help you move quickly without distraction. So literally what happens is your mind tunnels out and focuses on one thing, and it focuses on one thing, and then it runs at it with certainty because it doesn't see anything else. Now that's really important. If, a soccer ball goes out in the street and a kid goes running, you're not going to be like, oh, I better put down my cup of coffee before I go running. You're just going to drop it and run because your certainty is, I must stop that. And that's a great survival instinct when your very physical life is at stake. It's not a great business survival thing to do. So that if you're not going to pay attention to what's going on, what's going to happen is that you jump into action without seeking all the information available. And so what we're saying, the difference with the first responder is they have to act decisively with everything that they do know. So they have to be going through and figuring out, making sure they know everything versus acting decisively without all the information. And I can tell you something that's so interesting is that I watch lots of TV and police dramas. I'm sure we all do. And there's always this moment where, someone's life's at stake. They're, been kidnapped or something's happening that's really time sensitive. And, you're just like, my God, get in the car and run to like whatever tip you've got. And you see them standing around in a room looking at their boards. And what are they doing? They're saying, okay, what do we know about this situation? And they're checking in with everybody to see what everybody knows before they act. So even though there's a crisis at hand, the idea is that we need to know all our information available because we don't have a lot of time to act. So that action has to be the best thing we can possibly do. But even when you're watching that, your desire to just say, stop talking, get going, is a lot of how we do our business. Now I'm going to layer back in my friend 10 Bob 10. He's a friend in that, this story has been one of the most impactful stories of my career, which is the idea that, in a room where Bob is your CEO and he has an idea for a strategy that you're not maybe so sure is a great idea. And he says, I want to go around the room and get feedback. If he's asking for feedback out of 10, Bob gets a lot of 10s. People say, I give it a 10, I give it a 10. And, if you weren't going to give it a 10 and you're the seventh person to give your opinion, what's the likelihood you're going to say anything less? And so of course, when the person who initially told me the story about his life experience, he said he chickened out and said 9.5. And in my youth at the time, I was appalled that he didn't stand his ground, because in the end, it was a terrible decision. The company was gone in 18 months. But as I grew up and got myself into boardrooms, probably about 5 years after that story was told to me, I just like, oh, this is just what we do. We say 10 and then we leave the meeting and go, that's not really going to work. And I was like, why is it? And there's so many reasons for it. And it's not because people are spineless or don't have candor. There's an excitement as people are agreeing. And the excitement is this: agreement goes quickly. So if everybody's aligned or on the same page, it's like, okay, are we all on the same page? Are we all aligned? Do we all agree? And everybody's like, yeah. And this idea of moving quickly seems like that's the best outcome. And so if you're the person who's like, I'm not so sure, soon you're going to feel yourself voted off the island, because you're like stopping this wonderful momentum that's happening of wild agreement. And this is even the same in a crisis situation. When someone's like, we've got to act decisively, we've got to do this, what's the likelihood you're going to say, wait, I think we just need to consider a couple other things before we act? There's a lot of pressure not to do that. And so what John DeYoung mentions is that what people need is a simple, scalable framework for rapid decision making. That's what's critical. Is like you have to have a way to make decisions quickly, but to gather all that information quickly, so that it's not just you and a couple of people that make all the same decisions, who know all the same things in the same room. In fact, what you need to do is do the first responder, which is understand what everybody in the room knows, and then make a decision that is likely to have a better outcome. So what's interesting is, we call it scaling conversations at Thoughtexchange, which is the idea of how do you get that input quickly? And one of the things is you need to have a diverse group of people. So you have to broaden the pool. If you're asking the same 5 people what to do all the time, the chance that you're going to have a new and fresh and disruptive idea is very small. And then you have to be able to have independence. So it has to be able to go to everyone without that software I said that says this is who said it and this is why they said it. So you really just want to see the ideas on their own merit, rate them on their own merit, and then aggregate them. And so what we often hear from people is, I would have gone out to a broader group, but I didn't have time. And that's really interesting, because in fact, you can do it very quickly. But what happens is your tunnel vision often makes you blind to your ability to gather information quickly. So I'm going to give you some examples of the value of getting input, even when things feel like a crisis, and what happens when you don't. So this is a terrible memory from 2018, which is what happened with the Florida school shooting. And, in that situation, many different schools and were forced to think about what security they could put in this rash of school shootings. And we have a superintendent, Kevin McGowan, who's a great customer of ours. And he, told a story for us, which was so amazing, which was, in his area, they decided to put Foot Patrol, a partnership to, to patrol around the schools. So having armed people patrolling the schools and thinking that would make things safe. And that seemed like a really good decision because people wanted to act fast and decisively right after that. And he ran an exchange in his area asking people, how do you feel about us putting foot patrol in? And what ended up happening was something completely surprising, which was, the top thoughts, the thoughts that raised to the top were things that people hadn't considered, which was specifically around parents, Black parents with their children saying, I'm pretty concerned about what kind of training these police officers have, to break up fights, to manage different things with high school age children, because in theory, I think there's maybe more threat of armed police around the schools than of a random shooter. And so this feedback, even the feedback about, police officers standing with their hands on their hips, looks like they're standing with their hands on their guns, creating this environment that parents were really worried about, made this district superintendent, roll back that decision to do this. And I think that's such an interesting example of when you think you're acting in the best interest very quick, and then you gain input, you're like, oh, wait, maybe that wasn't the right decision. And obviously the ideal thing to do is to ask for that input beforehand. But we have this idea that I must act quickly. But when I'm acting quickly without acting with all the information available, what's the likelihood that's the best decision? In 2020, leaders were seeking tons of available information on things they didn't know. So we saw in our world all these exchanges popping up, like a 400 or 500% increase in use for us around COVID, around returning to work and remote learning, around anti-racism, DE&I, around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and then a lot about mental health and wellness at the end of the year as people started to suffer from a lot of isolation and Zoom burnout. And, what we were seeing here is because this was all new, this certainty tunnel vision started to dissipate as leaders started to say, I need to get more input from people. And I've shared these stats once before, which is, we ended up having 38,000 thoughts shared around COVID. This is last time I took the stats, almost 500,000 thoughts shared about remote learning, whether it's in school or remote work. Black Lives Matter, DE&I, we had 38,000 thoughts shared, mental health, 20,000 and growing. What I'm showing here is that that's a lot of different inputs that we're allowing leaders in real time to make informed decisions, like the way first responders do, which is I can't act with 100% certainty because nobody really knows what the right thing is. Nobody has all the information. In fact, when somebody says to me, listen, unless you're absolutely certain, I won't make that decision. I'm like, I guess we're not making a decision. So there isn't absolute certainty now, but there certainly can be more knowledge than people currently use. We had this also great example of the state of Connecticut that was ready, last spring into summer to bring everybody back to school. And they did a statewide exchange. And the quote that we got from the superintendent who led this charge, was essentially they had over 50,000 comments that were rated over a million times. And he said, everything changed. Everything changed in that moment. He hit send, and the entire perspective of the leaders of all the school districts in Connecticut shifted because parents started to say, parents, teachers, students, hey, keep the schools closed. They were saying, I'm worried about my kid being held back, but I'm more worried about the health of teachers. And in real time, right happening in the moment that he had sent, he was getting a theming of results. He was getting his word cloud. He was getting a summary of all the results. And so the idea that I can't involve people because it's going to take time is actually a myth. You can involve people and still make a decision swiftly, but it's informed. And, we also saw these pieces happening, which I thought was so interesting, which is as people were moving to remote work, this was the first time financial institutions who, before said there's no way we can because of security, were like asking questions like, what do we need to do as we're moving to remote? Like, I need to ask on the ground right now what we need to do. And, getting the thoughts from their people, from these teams, talking about making sure that we secure financial information, making sure we have a way to pay our vendors so our business stays open. And so you're getting all of this great information so that the decision you're going to make in that matter of 2-3 days is going to be informed as opposed to this panic version that you've got to roll back. And, we had a lot of people use us, and then we had some people who didn't. And what was interesting about that is I talked to one of the people who hadn't run any exchanges through all of this crazy COVID time. And the reaction I got was, we're moving so fast, there's so much going on, we don't have time. So we don't have time to consider everything because we're moving so fast. And, the list just grows, rest in peace of all the different organizations and companies that, are near and dear to our hearts that are not going to make it through this, who are already filing from bankruptcy. And largely their business models were being disrupted before, and they were likely keeping a 10 bob 10 mentality in terms of doubling down on traditional business methods and believing that there was only intelligence at a certain level in the organization. And then hit with the pandemic and the change in consumer needs, they didn't have the muscle in order to get all the information available to pivot their business model. So to sum it up before I get to my exchange, the C-suite is expected to act decisively right now. We can't slow down what we're doing, but you have two options. You can act fast without all the information, using a small group of people making assumptions based on outdated business paradigms, or you can swiftly gather all the relevant information available to make the best possible decision. That's really what we have to do. It's a small nuanced change that makes all the difference. Both are acting quickly, but one is with the traditional small group, not paying attention to everything they can. And the other one is collecting all the data they can to make that decision. And so as I sum up certainty from uncertainty, is, certainty is laden with power dynamics, ego, and outdated beliefs. So if you're having that in your C-suite, this is really the recipe to stay the course and to double down, which in fact, I don't think is really a possible way to lead to survival here. I think that's going to lead you to my bankruptcy page. Or you can move yourself and embrace uncertainty, which is really embracing listening, humility, flexibility, and questioning. So I want to invite you to participate in exchange so we can have a conversation together, because I've done a whole lot of talking. So what I'm going to do is put up my exchange, and there's going to be a link in the chat right now. And the exchange is asking you what questions, ideas, or comments do you have about how senior leaders need to adapt in times of uncertainty. So I'm looking for either some thoughts and things that you've done, comments on the content, or just questions. And I'm going to do in my traditional thought exchange way. If you have a phone available right now, you can put your phone on camera. Don't take a picture, just put your camera on and just hit the pop-up, and you're going to go in my exchange, or go in the exchange in the link. Again, share a thought. And if you don't have any thoughts, go in anyway. You can still read the thoughts of others. It's fun. So it's 3 steps: share thoughts, start the thoughts of others, and then we'll start our conversation. So I'm going to start my timer for 4 minutes, and then we'll dig in. Looking forward to it. I'm just going to stop share for a moment to bring it up, and we'll get going. Just give me a moment here. Get my screen going here. Coming back to you now. Inviting everybody to jump in. I'm enjoying what's in the chat as well. I'll just give you another few minutes here. Some good thoughts. I'm going to leave this open for another minute or so, maybe a little longer, to make sure everybody has a chance to write a thought and rate them. So about another minute to get some more ratings in. I'm just having a look to see. I don't see a lot of new thoughts coming in, so I might just jump in, but I will leave it open in case something pops into your mind and you want to add it. So interesting here. So here, the number one thought at this time, and continue to write and rate. I'm encouraging that. So leaders with the most empathy for their personalities. It says leaders with the most empathy in their personality profile seem to be more questioning when faced with difficult decisions. This made people feel cared for. I wish all leaders shared this trait. So this idea that people who have empathy are making people feel cared for. It's an interesting thing. It's almost, if you would like to do like what's connected to what, like, what bone's connected to what bone, is where does empathy inside a leadership trait? And what I found is interesting is there's two kinds of empathy. There's people have just empathy for like the greater situation. There's people what I call judgmental empathy. Judgmental empathy is like I reserve it for certain people in certain situations, and then I have none of it for others. And I think I see that in myself often as well. Like I can have all the time in the world to care and listen to certain situations. I have other situations that I find I might trigger me or feel like entitled or whiny, and then I'm actually quite curt and rude about them. And I think what happened in the pandemic is that, situations that made people, I think, sort of turned off about others, like family situations, mental health situations, things that we sort of attributed to like, ooh, I don't want to touch that because, that's like, so that means that the person's not productive or distracted, had to come into the forefront. So it's like if you watch TV, and we call it breaking the fourth wall. It's like when a character acknowledges the screen and acknowledges they're in a TV show. It was like leaders had to finally acknowledge that people have conflicts at home, issues with internet, issues with access, issues with mental health, and that we have to actually be skilling ourselves up to discuss it and talking to teams about how to have empathy for people's situations, maybe if they're homeschooling or caring for a loved one. And, organizations, that would start at the beginning, I started to see this trend for tracking software. I don't know if anybody noticed this, of like software so you can track how long people are on screens. There was a real outcry that was ridiculous, that we aren't treating people as human beings. And I think that's a really great thing that's happened, is that leaders were starting to be challenged to have conversations with people around, whether they were resourced or feeling okay, or if they needed any help. And so I think this word empathy sort of left this soft, squishy territory and became a leadership necessity. And companies that didn't were considered, really not with the times. And those that had the most empathy and had showed the most flexibility with their employees were being celebrated in the news media. And those who weren't were really being, called out for that. It says great info, listening is critical, especially in hybrid situations. Yeah, I'm going to say it's interesting, is I've been a remote worker for a long time, and I suffered from being the person who was trying to speak from the triangle in the middle of the room while everybody was in person. I don't know if everybody's been there, where you're like, and people just forget you're even there. And, I spent many years feeling like I can't have an opinion unless I'm sitting around that table. And what I found happened with this remote and hybrid workspace is people got really much more attentive to making sure that you weren't the only person on the screen while they're all in a room. And there was a democratization of having like the Brady Bunch screen where everybody is equal. And even people for us that were in the same location started to all get on their own device. And I actually think that's a way better experience for people going forward. And I hope we hold on to that, which is the idea that, if we really want everybody to have a voice, we have to, use the systems and technology to I'd say upend this traditional, if you're not in the room, your voice is not as important, or if you're not in that city. Letting go of the need to be right or perfect. Yeah, that's a big thing here. And I think that there was another one that I think this next one is related to it, which is, CEOs have to express their concerns to make good decisions in changing times. How do you express that in an organization that looks to them for competent leadership? And that was actually one of the musings in the chat as well, which is, I think people say, oh, I feel like a good CEO is somebody who makes decisions quickly, who acts decisive, who looks like they do know. And that's what we want from a leader. And I saw something really interesting happen in politics here, especially in Canada, in my country and in my province, is that both our Prime Minister and our Premier in Quebec had daily, updates. And a lot of the updates, especially in the initial crisis, didn't have answers. It was like, here's what we know, here's what we're working on, here's what we know, here's what we're working on. And guess what? Approval ratings shot up. Didn't shoot up because they were like, we've figured out COVID and we've figured out what to do. They shot up because they were showing up as human beings. They were surrounded by their medical expert and people who were like sharing their expertise. And they were just saying, here's where we're at, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's what we're looking into. And what people really gain confidence is in the communication and the transparency. They didn't gain confidence in you curing the situation. There was no question that you were going to understand or fix it overnight. And the leaders that vanished in that time or didn't communicate are the ones that people felt a lack of confidence with. So it was for me an interesting shift to see, people's confidence grow without getting answers from their leaders, but just feeling like they were able to participate, share, and ask questions. Having to be flexible as the impact of the spread keeps changing and governments need to adjust lockdown measures. That's also a really interesting one, is we're watching a lot of people making decisions and then rolling them back and then trial and error. And I would say in some cases, I think they're looking at all the information available, and at other times it could be knee jerk. It depends on where you are in the world right now. But what I also find interesting in this flexible thing is that as opposed to feeling like you're the only one doing this, we have mini versions of lockdowns and measures all over the world. And we now have the data that shows which ones are more effective and which ones are less. And it is interesting to think that when people are putting in measures and ignoring the ones that worked elsewhere and adopting ones that maybe didn't work, you start to sort of wonder, why are you choosing to ignore data that's readily available? So, it's an interesting time because countries and places that normally wouldn't get looked to. I know New Zealand's using an example that wouldn't be in the news every day. It's in the news because what they're doing, or in South Korea has been more successful than what we're doing. And so the question is, why aren't we adopting that? Why aren't we looking at the information available to take action? And that's the same in companies. I worked for a period of time in a big box in a department store. That's a business that's having a lot of trouble. And when I was in there, there was a discussion from, I'm in Canada, they would be talking about what the competition is doing. And they would be talking about the other big box retailers. Basically, we call them the anchors in them all. One anchor, one anchor, one anchor. So they'd be like, this anchor's open at this time. This anchor's got this on sale. And they were like, so this is what we're going to do. And I'm from specialty retail. And I would be like, what's interesting? There's about 200 profitable businesses between us and the other anchor. Why are we not at all curious what they're doing? Because, neither of us anchors are actually doing well right now. But there was this feeling of like, ooh, I'm not going to look at what all those little guys are doing. It doesn't apply to us. And in fact, specialty retail has done far better than department stores. And I think it's because they were picking and choosing what data they were going to pay attention to. Having to be flexible as the impact of the spread keeps changing and governments adjust. Sorry, I did read that one already. Tone deaf messages from leadership can be more harmful than not communicating. Yes. So I think vanishing is the worst thing you can do. I had a situation where we talked about doing town halls, daily, weekly, and somebody said, listen, I just don't want to over communicate. And all the exchanges that we did initially internally with our customers were like, what do we need to do to help you? It was like communicate, communicate. It was the number one theme in every single exchange of what do you need from us, which was even communicate, you have nothing to communicate. I completely agree. The idea that we're better off to say nothing unless we have an answer is an old paradigm, that you actually have an answer that we're all waiting for. Participating and discussing with us what you do know and asking for our input is far more important than having the answer to things. I'm looking over here. David, I do not know about the book Wait, and I will look into it myself as well. Are there new leader attributes that we should look at as we promote people? And how does mental health play a role? Well, I have something interesting to tell you that was so, you can Google this as well. How does mental health play in the competencies and what should we be looking for? And, this is a great study. It was done in Israel, and it was done with about 5,000 different judges, and they were looking at what factors impact parole. So what factor impacts you getting paroled? If you know, this is an amazing and interesting study. And what they found was, when they, looked, they separated all the data for all the other variables there could be around what gives somebody parole. The single only variable that actually determined your likelihood for parole was, wait for it, the time of day your case was heard. So if your case was heard first thing in the morning or right after lunch, you had about a 65% chance of getting parole. If you were right before, if you were the last case before lunch or the last case before going home, your chance went down to 0. Let's unpack that. What it means is that when the people were refreshed and calm, they'd had a break, they were nourished, they were sitting down, they hadn't been sitting too long, they were listening to all the factors, weighing it all, their prefrontal cortex was able to take it in. And when you're granting someone parole, there's a lot of thinking you have to do and processing you have to do. And when they were exhausted, tired, or ready to go on a break, they just said no, because just saying no just shuts it all down and it's over. Now, this to me is a huge factor about when you're asking me, what are the attributes we should look at and how does mental health play in? Mental health plays in the sense that if you are in a state of hijack, if you're in an exhausted, tired, hungry, perpetual state of imagined emergency, the likelihood that you're going to be open to something new and complex is very small. The likelihood you're going to have tunnel vision and be closed and hold on to certainty is very high, because that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is really greedy. It takes a ton of energy to run it. And so your body is going to reserve use of it for when it has enough energy. So what I would say leader attributes is you really want to look at somebody who can recognize when they're not thinking with their strategic brain. They can recognize that they're exhausted and tired and remove themselves from that situation and say, my brain's not up to listening to this right now. Let me, get that rest, and then let's repitch the idea. What you don't want to have is people who ignore all the symptoms that they have, that they're in a state of exhaustion or hijack, and then turn down or shut people down, not because the idea is not good, it's because it's the wrong time of day to do it. And so there's a big factor here. So I know that, I wasn't a huge mindfulness person. I didn't get on that thing a long time ago, but I don't know if you should watch. There's a Netflix show that talks about the brain, and there was one on mindfulness. It's actually quite wonderful. And it talks about the power of being able to, using breathing and meditative techniques, is to engage this part of your brain and to control it. And I think that if you're asking me what you want people to do, is I want to see people who are in a state of pressure take a deep breath, take a step back, go for a walk, still stay curious, still ask questions. And if you can see that in somebody, I call it the core of calm, is what I look for in somebody, where they're just the whole way they react is like, oh, that's odd. Okay, what do you think that's going on? And they continue to ask questions in a state of crisis versus getting into an action thing right away. That's a huge factor for me in someone I can trust to make decisions. I'll do a couple more so I can let you have a bio break before your next meeting. How do you emphasize the need to change a CEO perhaps that's stuck in the old paradigm? It's such an interesting thing when you say stuck in the old paradigm. I think there's two things I would do. An outdated beliefs exchange is actually really powerful for an executive team. So you're in the room where there's lots of 10 Bob 10s happened, and it's hard to wash that out of the room, whether the room's on Zoom or Teams, the room is in real life, is that if when that has happened. So I've told 10 Bob 10 to the Bob of the story, and they've been like, oh yeah, I hate that when I'm in the meeting with this board member. Like, it's really hard to know your Bob. it's hard because you just think everybody agrees with you and you remember yourself as this accessible, cool person who everybody's totally natural with. You've forgotten that you've become Bob, and many people, I've yet to find Bob when I'm telling the story to actually realize they're the Bob in the story and not the person around the table. So what I would say here is an interesting thing I've done with Bobs when I'm talking to them is to say, why don't we get everyone around and do an outdated beliefs? What are outdated beliefs about how this executive team functions that we need to change? And we do that exchange. And if it's a small group, I then do 3 thoughts each to keep it nice and anonymous. And as people are writing and rating, first of all, people are laughing, they're finding it funny, it's coming up on the screen. And when it's up on the screen, that CEO just sees it. And I've done it before. I've had the person look and go, really? That's what it's like here? Why haven't you said anything? And then I'm just like, let's not worry about why you didn't know before. Let's worry about what we're going to do now. And then we workshop and break up what we see on the screen. And people feel really comfortable and validated. I've also had another thing I do with Bob CEOs, which is to ask them to not weigh in on something, but to put their thought in the exchange and see how it fares without their name attached to it. And it's hard. Look, I do it with my own team. If I bring up an idea, everybody supports it. If I put it in an exchange, it might be thought 26. And so and then I'm like, oof, gosh, I've got to sort of rethink what that means for me. But it's a really great exercise to do that. So I think I'll do one more. Yes, reframing uncertainty. I really think if you can embrace this period of uncertainty as the best thing that's ever happened to us, I've tried to do that. I've been like, I'm liberated. I'm allowed to be curious. I'm allowed to search things out. I'm allowed to try things. I'm allowed to tell people, I don't know, I got to look into that. I'm calling my network, the people that I used to work with, and saying, what are you doing with this? I'm sending out more questions than I've ever had my whole life. I feel like I'm allowed to be curious and I'm allowed not to have answers. It's actually amazing. Okay, my last one here is, does everything, I'm just making sure I haven't moved things here. Leading with questions rather than answers. Leadership at my organization is double down on old thinking, keeping decision-making in the same group. Yeah, it's frustrating for employees. Listen, like I said that, I had a situation with a company where I asked them, hey, you haven't run any exchanges. And they were like, oh, we're just moving too fast. We don't have time for that. And I think what's happening here is that, it's something that was even mentioned in the chat. It's like, there's ego involved and there's just, a pattern of behavior that hasn't been disrupted. And interrupting a pattern is really hard. And so I think what you really want to do is say, here's the pattern of how we've done business and maybe list several things. And you can ask, okay, this is what we used to do. I call it from to. This is from what we used to do. The small group of people making all these decisions. And we're trying to make a shift to having more voices. And then you just say to that executive team, what could we do to do that shift? And you might need to use some data. There's a lot out there about how broad groups of diverse people make better decisions than small groups of experts. So I'd say, make a business case around, the impact of bias and the impact of small groups versus diverse. Make a business case that shows that, in fact, the business outcomes are greater when this large group is involved of a diverse group, and that we remove bias from these conversations. We're going to have better business outcomes, and believe that these people, regardless of what they're doing in their behavior right now, are trying to play a long game. And my belief is, over time, you can have that influence if you make the right business case. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. I will review the exchange, and see if there's anything else I can answer and send out. I encourage you to link in with me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Deslin Wood. Love to talk to you about anything that's on your mind. And we also can take you through Thoughtexchange so you can see some of the amazing data I just collected that you are not aware of about, how people are rating and what people are thinking. And I just want to wish you a wonderful, mid-February day. January. You can see where my mind is already. Anyway, take care, have a great day, and I'll see you for next time. Thank you.